The issue of academic study of Torah, or as it's popularly called, biblical criticism, is a vexing issue. Many of us here in the room, certainly myself, we've gone to university. We've learned to apply critical thinking in our lives. And as we read broadly, we see that the questions that catch the ear of Medrash and of the commentators also catch the ear of academics. And that academics will suggest often appealing answers of their own, which might clash with the sort of traditional classical answers that we learned perhaps in day school. We see that a modern awareness of history and the evolution of cultures gives us a different and often challenging view of the explanations themselves that are offered by traditional commentators. And so we ask ourselves, we're trained to seek truth and to do so with a critical eye. So what are we to do when the information that is in front of our critical eyes seems to lead us in directions that seem antithetical to our tradition? It's a question I have faced personally for years. My great-uncle, Naftali Torczyner, was a pioneering philologist in Israel and a scholar of Semitic languages who contributed significantly to the academic study of Torah. And I've read his writings and asked the question of, so what do I do with this? So I think it's a pressing question for many of us, and I was talking to Rabbi Weintraub about what topic would appeal to our broad range of supporting members, and this one came naturally. And then when Rabbi Lichtenstein became available, it was a perfect fit. Quite a few of you were at the program we held in this room last year in honor of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein's 80th birthday. And Rav Aaron, of course, is Rav Moshe's father. And at the time, we talked about Rav Aaron as an Ish HaEshkolot, in the sense that it was explained by the commentator Meiri on the Talmud. An Ish HaEshkolot is somebody who possesses Shleimut HaMidot, a perfection of character, along with Shleimut HaChochmot, a perfection of intelligence and of knowledge. And Rav Aaron is somebody who is honest and ethical and learned and worldly and articulate and possessed of remarkable clarity of vision and expression. And in the 3 years that I worked alongside Rav Baruch, I saw within him someone who aspired to those traits and who apprenticed himself to a mentor, Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, who is an heir to the traits as well. Our community has benefited from Rav Moshe's teachings, if only by reading Toronto Torah. In a Haftorah article from Parshas Naso, Rav Baruch quoted Rav Moshe on the difference between Chana, mother of Shmuel, and Hatzlel Ponit, the mother of Shimshon, and offered an insight into the Torah's presentation of husband-wife relationships. In another article, Rav Baruch quoted Rav Moshe on the character of Rachav, the woman who saved the 2 Jewish spies in the city of Yericho at the start of the book of Joshua. And Rav Moshe offered a keen insight into the culture of Canaan and how it affected Rachav's career and her life. In a third piece, Rav Baruch quoted Rav Moshe on the reasons why a woman who gives birth is expected to bring a korban offering to God afterward, and offered a perspective of the Torah regarding the psychological and emotional reactions associated with giving birth to a child, and on and on. And if you don't yet read Toronto Torah, let that be an advertisement. But tonight we'll have the opportunity to hear Rav Moshe speak about this compelling topic. Again, I am most grateful to Rabbi Weintraub for his help in setting this up, and to Yeshivat Har Etzion for making this opportunity available. And I look forward to hearing what Rav Moshe will say. All of you had the chance already to read Rav Moshe's official bio. I think I sent it out in a Beit Midrash email, so I will just condense and say that Rav Moshe came on Aliyah with his family in 1971. From 1979 to 1985, he did Hesder at Yeshivat Har Etzion, serving in the Armored Corps of the IDF. He received smicha from the Rabbanut, degrees in English literature from Hebrew University. Rav Moshe has been a Ram in Yeshivat Har Etzion since 1992. While on sabbatical in Cleveland during the 1997-1998 academic years, Rav Moshe served as the Rosh Kol of the Torah Mitzion Kollel in Cleveland. He also taught at Bruria, an advanced program for women in Jerusalem from 1992 to 1997. Rav Moshe was inaugurated as Rosh Yeshiva in Tishrei 5769 alongside his father, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, and Rav Yaakov Meidan, Rav Baruch Gigi. He is married to Dr. Michal Lichtenstein and has 3 daughters. And without further ado, Rav Moshe.
This is the Jewish people. This is the Jewish Torah. Of course, people, Am Yisrael and Torah Yisrael, throughout the generations have gone hand in hand. the ability to deal and to remain vibrant in all circumstances seems very fitting and very appropriate for such an evening. And of course, I'd like to thank the Rubinsteins, Rabbi Torczyner and Rabbi Weintraub. I do plead guilty to spending many hours teaching Rabbi Weintraub. That's my the only thing in the Bible which I would plead guilty to is that okay, really, I'm glad to be here. I hope I'll feel just as good when I finish, and you'll feel just as good when I finish, because the topic which is chosen is very relevant and very important, but it's a minefield. Whatever I say, I assume not of all the people in the room, people have different opinions and are coming from different places. What I say, I'll satisfy 2 and anger 10, and I will probably in the evening confuse myself. On the other end, I really don't know why I agreed to talk about this topic, except for the simple reason that I think if it's hard to understand why I agreed to talk, it'd be impossible to understand how not to talk about it. Because, as my Torczyner said before, it indeed is an issue which requires educational guidance, and we can't just run away from topics which may be difficult. So therefore, I'll be glad to address the topic. And this is the first point I'd like to make. I do not want to begin by describing the problems or the challenges. I want to begin by describing a more positive outlook. I want to begin by describing not what the challenges of academic Torah study or what the challenges of biblical criticism, but to present a certain vision of what we have in mind for Torah, where's Torah coming to serve us. Afterwards, after we will define what our relationship to Torah is, we can then ask how this will fit in. Is this compatible, incompatible with other approaches and the like? As rather to begin from being apologetic, I would rather to begin from asserting a certain vision of our own regarding Torah, and then from that vision to go and examine how this fits in with other approaches. Therefore, I'll begin by saying a few words about the relationship of Torah and Emunah, of Torah and faith within Am Yisrael. So we all know, we say, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Asher Tzlicha Meretz Yitzrayim. I am Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Lord your God, who took you out of Egypt, and afterwards the Torah begins giving us all the mitzvot, all the commandments. Chazal tell us, Kibalta Malchuti, Kablu Gzerutai. You accepted my sovereignty, accept therefore also the mitzvot and the prescriptions that I prescribe to you to obey. The lead up, this is in Shemot, the 20th chapter. The lead up, of course, is the 19th, in which the whole set of Mamad Har Sinai of basically the whole ceremony leading up to the actual proclamation of Anochi Hashem Elokecha is described in great detail by the Torah, how Bnei Yisrael come in the wilderness and they camp next to Mount Sinai, and as they go up, and Moshe Rabbeinu goes back and forth, and God tells them what to tell the people and how to set them up. Should they be distant? Should they be close? And the whole description thereof we call Ma'amad Har Sinai, the ceremony at Mount Sinai, which is of course a basic element. The Torah describes devotes a lot of attention to it, both in Sefer Shemot, when it tells us the story of Matan Torah the first time around, and also in Sefer Dvarim. When we read it, Moshe Rabbeinu recaps everything that happened throughout the 40 years. Once more, he describes in great detail not only the actual giving of the Torah, but also describes the whole ceremony and the process leading up to it. And in Rishonim, in medieval commentators, there's a whole approach which, in a sense, gives great weight to this. In other words, not only to the actual giving of the Torah, but to the ceremony surrounding it. According to Ramban and Nachmanides, there's a mitzvah from the Torah to remember, whether daily or yearly or whatever, or to have in your consciousness, but there's a mitzvah to constantly remember Ma'amad Har Sinai. Not only the Torah itself, not only to remember the Torah and the content of the Torah, but also to remember and to have as part of our collective consciousness the ceremony, Ma'amad Har Sinai. The Rambam and the Ramban and many others tell us Why does the Torah devote so much attention? Because this basically is the guarantee or the safeguard for the authenticity of the Torah. Or to put it differently, Anochi Hashem Elokecha is predicated, is based upon the idea of Mamad Har Sinai. This guarantees the authenticity of the Torah. So you really have to have this as a basis before you say Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Now, it's exactly this point where I like to diverge from their perspective and to, in a sense, to suggest a reverse. Essentially, for the modern believer, for a person living a life of faith in the 21st century, the 20th century, it does not begin from Mamad Har Sinai. We begin by faith at the moment is based upon, it's not based on any logical proof, it's not based upon historical proof, it's not based upon, we do not any longer really work off a cosmological proof or ontological proof. Rather, we basically tell ourselves that it's an act of faith, that it's the experience. In other words, we begin from experiencing the experience of faith. And the world itself is open to various interpretations. If in the Middle Ages they believed that you could argue from nature the belief of God, to a large degree we tell ourselves, or we assume at the moment, that nature is open to dual interpretation, both an interpretation of faith and belief and a secular interpretation. And therefore there are secular scientists and religious scientists. If science is giving a message which is clear-cut and which is beyond a doubt, so all scientists would either be religious or be atheists. The fact that you have religious scientists and non-religious scientists, that you have atheists and believers in the scientific community, and they work side by side in the same laboratory or in the same, doing the same experiments, tells you that God gave a world endowed us with free choice, gave a world in which you can read coherently, you can provide a reading of the world which is either one or the other. Now, I think clearly it's clearly expected of us to make a certain decision. It's not do what you want because, but the decision is rooted more in the experience, not in the proof, not in the logic, but in the experience. A person facing eternity, a person facing the cosmos, feels within him an experience of faith which begins at some point within his soul. Soul feels that it yearns for something beyond the here and the now. It yearns to transcend itself, and that's essentially what takes us on a journey of faith. Now, what is the relevance of this our topic tonight? I think the relevance is as follows. We do not, this is the crucial statement. If Cardinal Newman said that I do not believe in God because I see design in nature, rather because I believe in God, therefore I see design in nature, to a large degree, that's also, to paraphrase him, that to a large degree is the way we view the relationship between the Kadosh Baruch Hu and Torah. Because we believe, because we say Anochi Hashem Elokecha, because we deeply believe in the Kadosh Baruch Hu, therefore the Torah is important. It's not because the Torah is true, therefore we believe in God. It's because we believe in the Kadosh Baruch Hu, therefore the Torah becomes crucial and important for us. It begins, the starting point is not the Torah, it's the Kadosh Baruch Hu. But since the Torah is God's message to us, and since we deeply believe in the Kadosh Baruch Hu, for reasons outside the Torah, I said before, because we experience God in history, we experience God in nature, we experience God in the soul, and because we accept the Torah as His, capital H, as His word to us, as His message, therefore Torah becomes crucial and relevant. So I do not begin from the text and move from the text onto faith. It's I begin from faith and therefore move on to the text. Now, so therefore, if a person has problems, if a person should tell himself, since I find the text so convincing, or the text has a certain message, therefore I will be a believer. It's rather, since I'm a believer, therefore the text matters so much to me. And if I'm a believer, and I view the text as God's word, so now clearly I have to, if that is the case, so I have to ask myself not what, I have to ask myself, what should God do with the text? In other words, it's not, what does the text tell me? That I have a blank text, let me now analyze it, and having analyzed the text, I arrive at certain conclusions about the authorship and the like. Rather, my starting point is, I believe in the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and I accept the Torah as His word. Now, there's a certain logical leap over here, of course, because I can believe in God without accepting the Torah. But if I believe in the Kadosh Baruch Hu and the Torah is relevant to me as His word, so I have to ask myself, what is the nature? In other words, what kind of text would He want to produce? What kind of text can He produce? And therefore, the starting point for any Orthodox response has to be, therefore, that we accept the divinity of the text and the ability of the divine author to have a text of a nature which reflects his message to us. So all this is independent of biblical criticism. This is just to discuss in the contemporary world of faith, what is the relationship of text to, do I begin from the text and therefore ask about the author? Or do I begin with the author and therefore ask about the text? Because I can always, it's true of any text you have, if you know who the author is, you can then you can arrive at certain assumptions or axioms about the text. And reversely, if you don't know who the author is, you can read the text and try to fathom who the author is. But if we accept the Torah as Dvar Hashem, which is basically the essence of an Orthodox position to begin with, so we must, therefore we have to treat the text as such. Since I know the author, therefore I have to treat the text accordingly. Now, having said all this, let me now move on to directly to the issue at hand. Academic or critical, biblical criticism, to use a phrase, attempts to think critically about the biblical text. That's what Torczyner mentioned before. Obviously, we think critical thinking is a good thing. To think critically about most things, we believe takes man's capabilities, it takes our faculties, allows us to apply them to the world, whether it's in physics, or in biology, or in sociology, or in economics, or in any other text, whether it's in the natural sciences, the social sciences, or the humanities, and to use the gift that Kodesh Baruch Hu gave us. God gave us the gift, of course, the gift of reason and rationality. And this will allow us to enhance our understanding. And so I want to understand the world better. I want to understand the world in a deeper manner by using my critical faculties about the natural world. The same is true, of course, should be of the world of the humanities as well. And if we want to learn literature at its best, and we want to use or history, it's actually true about Tanakh as well. And undoubtedly, as I said before, there's a lot to be said for critical thinking. I'll talk later on about the problems as well, but clearly, from a starting point, a priori, we should assume that critical thinking is a positive. Now, I think the truth is indeed so. However, we also have to ask ourselves a different question, or an additional question, which is, what is the nature of such criticism? Or the critical faculty, what is it attempting to achieve, or how is it working? And here, in a sense, there are two different, we're doing one thing, namely analyzing a text, however, or viewing the text from different perspectives, if you want, comparing it, whether it's to various external sources, whether literary or historical, archaeological, and the like. However, of course, the analysis is predicated upon a certain perspective. Take for a moment natural science. Natural science, of course, analyzes natural phenomena, but it's based upon a certain metaphysics. In other words, we have a certain idea of causality, without which we cannot begin to engage in physics or in biology. If we were to assume that, for example, if we were to assume that you can have non-physical forces influence the physical world, so you couldn't necessarily do experiments because maybe there are angels or demons or shadim intervening. You have to have a certain set of, you have to have a certain basic rules or axioms regarding what is considered a legitimate cause and what is outside the pale. What do you rule out? So if I tell you that, I'll just give an example. Years ago, someone told me about a certain tzaddik, that he's such a tzaddik, he can go by car from Yerushalayim to Haifa, even though there's no gas in the car. There's the petrol, the gas, I don't know if you say here in Canada. You can travel without any gasoline in the car. Now, if you're a mystic or if you're a chassid, so you can, it makes sense. Now the Rebbe can think, he can will his way, and now if you're a Litvak, unfortunately, so you can't believe such a thing. So when I was 18, when I was 16, I was told this. I said it can't be. When I'm already a bit older than 16, so now I know that the manufacturer of the car takes human psychology into effect as well as other things. So there's what someone in Yeshiva Baruch once called there's high empty and low empty, and when the gauge is on empty, it's not quite empty, it's really only medium empty, and there's beyond the gauge, there's some in the gasoline left for people like me who forget to fill up on time. Now all this is based upon the idea that it's impossible that someone can ride in a car, even if he's a tzaddik, because God doesn't suspend certain rules for him. We have these rules, and we have to abide by them. And so therefore it's crucial always to decide what are the rules that you accept. If you believe, when you say that you go Bezrat Hashem you travel Bezrat Hashem from Yerushalayim to Tel Aviv. So we obviously mean that I'm driving with a car and with gas and with wheels, etc. And Kodesh Baruch was just helping me that the car will function. If I were to believe in a different set of rules, so Bezrat Hashem would mean a chariot of fire which would transport me. But we have certain rules or certain axioms regarding causality. And what's true in physics is true also in other spheres as well. And this is the crucial point. What is the metaphysic of that you bring with you when you come to approach the biblical text? You can have it, I'll ask a simple question. How come biblical criticism, academic Bible study began to clash with religion in the 19th century? It didn't happen just coincidentally. It's when, based upon changes in philosophy, and when you enter with a whole new philosophical approach. So therefore, these with parallel developments in philosophy and the more skeptical approach. So therefore, these axioms were questioned. It's not in the 13th and 12th century. The same problems were not considered problems because there was a different set of metaphysical axioms beneath them. And you have to ask yourself always what are the underlying assumptions, which are the linchpins upon which the criticism or the analysis is based. And there are certain theological or metaphysical assumptions always lurking beneath the text. Just to give you a simple example, if I believe in miracles, or if I believe in a divine authorship, and I believe in prophecy, so you can foresee the future. And therefore, if a text foresees something in the future, so you don't consider it a problem. If you deny that, so of course this creates a problem, and you have to assume that the text is later on in time. At the moment, I'm not discussing whether there's anything wrong or right with that. I'm just saying that the assumptions that you make to begin with will dictate often your conclusions. Because I said a moment ago, if I believe in the divine nature of the text and God's omnipotence, so that he can do many things which, if I do not believe in, he cannot do. And therefore, I will have to arrive at, if I don't believe in this, I have to arrive at certain conclusions, which I will not necessarily have to arrive at if I do. And this, in a sense, is where the problem lies. Because in its essence, the problems, now let's not begin to define the problem, because I said before I was talking more, up to I spoke about what we want from Torah, where the problems exist. Problems exist when the conclusions or the claims of biblical criticism clash with those of traditional Judaism or the principles of faith of Orthodoxy. Now, without attempting at the moment to enumerate them or to define them, and I don't claim to be an expert in all these fields, there's certainly areas in which some of the conclusions seem to clash with what is considered traditional Judaism, what the Rambam defined as part of the Gimel Ikarim, or the 13 Principles of Faith, or others. Now, at its root, it's really it's the old issue of faith and science, which is not unique to Bible. It's true about Middle Ages. They were disturbed by other problems. It could be problems of physics, a created world versus a non-created, an eternal world. It could be problems of biology and evolution. And there are many areas in which the tension between revelation and observation, what the Torah tells us, or what Jewish tradition tells us, and what we observe, this tension is basic in many areas, and this is simply another example, a unique one maybe, but nevertheless, has to be seen as part of the broader perspective of the clash between religion and science, not the clash, the tension at least between religion and science, and essentially there can be, in theory, a priori, there could be 3 or maybe 4 approaches. Throughout the Middle Ages, a good deal of energy was expended by Jewish philosophers, or Baalei Machshava, to deal with this. Whether it's the anthropomorphism problems that the Rambam was so preoccupied by, which is just one example. And one approach is, of course, in theory, you can take one approach and deny everything. In other words, if I have revelation, on the other hand, I have observation, or if you want, reason versus faith, I can choose one over the other. I can either A or B, or I can somehow seek some kind of middle ground. In our case, before I discuss whether to choose one or the other, to seek some kind of synthesis, but what I'm trying to say is that you have to recognize first that the conclusions reflect a certain metaphysic to begin with. And when you come therefore to ask yourself, besides for asking, should I choose A over B or B over A, you have to ask yourself, what are the underlying assumptions of A, and what are the underlying assumptions of B? In other words, what's the metaphysic which leads to such conclusions? And then you have to ask yourself the question, do I subscribe to these assumptions, these axioms, or not? Because if I do not subscribe to them, or if I recognize them, so then it changes the whole picture regarding my choice. And this is in a sense the crucial part of the story, recognizing that biblical criticism rests upon a certain metaphysics, the same way physics do, the same way biology does, and so on and so forth. However, in this case, biblical criticism is a discipline which, to the best of my understanding at least, reflects either a secular Protestant approach, and the axioms there do not necessarily are not so compatible with an Orthodox Jewish approach to begin with, and therefore the conclusions are often different because the starting points are different, yet the starting points are often masked and not above the surface. And if we were to come and lay them bare and then ask ourselves to which set of axioms do we subscribe, that'd be one discussion. What happens often is we look at the symptom, or in other words, we look at the conclusions, the practical conclusions, and not necessarily the underlying assumptions, and then we're presented with a different set of data. And since we are not told that there are competing axioms, so then we ask ourselves, well, how do we choose amongst the conclusions? But that's why I think that you have to start by recognizing the fact these conclusions are dictated by the assumptions beneath them. Okay, now, nevertheless, there are of course conclusions, or this data. And if I'll take what I said a moment ago, this data can really derive from one or two sources. Either I said before, it's predicated upon certain assumptions and certain axioms. B, from an analysis of the text. At times, the analysis alone will bring to these conclusions. At other times, it's the combination. And now, these conclusions at times are compatible, at times are incompatible. If they're compatible, so fine. We'll talk about it in a moment. If they're incompatible, so this is another example of, as I said before, the more broader issue of faith and science or revelation and reason. And here you have the following options. Option number one is to choose A over B. Now, since this means either following reason and science or following the Torah, if you're an Orthodox Jew, rejecting the Torah and choosing only science, or choosing only the conclusions of academic conclusions which contradict the Torah, and declaring the Torah is an error, if you're an Orthodox Jew, in a sense, that's not an option. Because, as I said before, we begin from the starting point is that we believe in Torah, and we believe in Kadosh Baruch Hu and Torah. So therefore, that leads you to two other options. Either to reject out of hand all the academic conclusions, or, now that of course gets to the other problem. Well, can we really deny everything that our reason tells us? Can we deny observation? So the answer, as I said before, I think is twofold. In some instances, the answer is yes, because if we will dig deeper, we recognize that these observations are based upon a metaphysics that we do not subscribe to. On another level, however, that's part of the time. In other parts, the answer is no. I think the answer is that if the observation is correct and it is not coming from a contradictory starting point, we should indeed accept it, or we should at least take into account that is a legitimate possibility which should be taken into consideration. And therefore, we have to now. Therefore, we should certainly accept, or at least entertain the possibility of accepting certain conclusions, while not necessarily others. The moment that these conclusions are based upon observation of the text, so they become, in a sense, other suggestions or suggestions of parshanut. Now, it's simply it's exegesis, which is legitimate. It comes to a certain perspective. If we talk about differing approaches to texts, when you have a large text, if you want different texts, you can emphasize the harmony, you can emphasize the tension between them, you can come with more of a dialectic or more of a monolithic approach. They are both, in theory, legitimate. It's possible to choose one. It's possible to choose a more harmonizing vision as opposed to one which is more, which creates greater tension within the text. And if academic study points us in the direction of greater tension, there's nothing wrong with that per se. And if it points out inconsistencies which would seem to point to a tension or different perspectives, as long as the different perspectives do not reflect, before starting, lurking assumptions or axioms which are incompatible with our beliefs for various reasons, as long as simply they point inconsistencies which are conceivable, we can have, there's nothing wrong with viewing the text as having a lot of tension within it or having a dialectic. It's certainly possible to adopt such conclusions, but then they become really parshanut. In other words, I think some of the suggestions, some of the theories are not simply questions of possible interpretations. They represent a differing metaphysic. At other times, they do not. In your third case, is we can argue whether they really, to which of these two categories do they belong. And this brings you to an important point. It's possible to point out many precedents in traditional commentators to many of the conclusions and many of the data which you find later on in contemporary academic scholarship. Not everything, of course, but the idea that, for instance, the idea that certain psukim are post-Mosaic, you can find that in previous texts as well, and many things which nowadays we consider outside the pale of orthodoxy were said by many important people 800, 900 years ago, and those are all considered Kedoshim and Tohorim. Rav Bazak wrote a book about a year or two ago in Hebrew, in which he has probably hundreds of examples like this, certainly tens, but I think it's probably a three-figure number at least, in which he details how you can see such and such, so-and-so said such and such 800 years ago, 700 years ago, all people who, of course, are in the pantheon of legitimate traditional commentators. However, the point I made before here is crucial. If Frida Chassid writes that the few psukim are post Moshe Rabbeinu and are later, now when he's writing this in the 13th century, it does not reflect any particular metaphysic. He's not trying to change the metaphysic of the entire world. He's not at odds with his neighbors, the Balei Tosfos, in terms of his metaphysic, in terms of his basic approach. He thinks for local considerations that he can say this is a bit later. So the Gemara will tell us that 8 psukim were written post Moshe Rabbeinu, according to one opinion. So he says it's not 8, it's 28, or whatever. The number is just an example. Now, but he's not trying to change the underlying axioms. He's simply coming to tell you because he thinks it's more logical from a point of view interpretation, from an exegetical point of view, to make such a claim. The Rambam thinks that there's a metaphysic involved in this. The Rambam thought that Moshe Rabbeinu has to write everything because qualitatively his prophecy is different. So the Rambam rejects such a position on a metaphysical grounds, essentially. But since already you have 2 opinions in the Talmud about this, so he's willing to adopt the other opinion, but it's not a sea change in metaphysic. However, when you come late 19th century or post-Wellhausen and you make such a claim, your starting point is not simply, it's loaded with a whole different metaphysical baggage. It now reflects a whole different perspective. It's not simply a claim about an individual pasuk. It's now coming, it's really it's the tip of the iceberg, which reflects the whole metaphysic lurking beneath the surface, which is different. So the fact that I can show that you can demonstrate that the conclusions were similar, that's not the important point. I said before, the data or the suggestions are suggestions you can agree or disagree with. The real point of contention is, or the real problem, then when it becomes problematic, do these conclusions reflect a different metaphysic which we cannot live with, which is incompatible with Orthodox belief? So there's no problem with making statement A or B, and whatever you can dig up in the Radak, or you can dig up in various other such commentators, doesn't it just proves that such suggestions in terms of exegetical content are legitimate. However, it doesn't validate biblical criticism, because biblical criticism, the best I understand, is starting from a different metaphysical perspective, and therefore it's a whole different ballgame. Here it's parshanut, and here it's bikoret. Here it's criticism, here it's simply interpretation and suggestion. I would also add something else, that quantity at times becomes quality. I'll give you an example. The Talmud tells us, Chazal tell us, that Eov is a literary work, meaning Eov was not a historical figure. Eov lo hayav lo nivra. Eov never existed. He's a literary figure, not a historical figure. Now, it's one thing that, now in theory, if you could say about Eov, you could say that about many, many other figures. However, quantity here, or who you're talking about, makes a big difference. My father said once, to say that Eov never existed, he's a literary figure, is one thing. To say about Avram Avinu is something else, because Avram Avinu is central to our tradition, or I would say differently, Avram Avinu matters for us not only as a paradigm of faith and justice, in which case it can be a literary paradigm. He matters because he's our great-grandfather, because our historical continuity, because we have a covenant that's called Brit Avot, because we are in history an extension of him and his lineage. So who you talk about does make a difference. So it's one thing to say about Eov or about some of the peripheral figures. So he has to say that about Avram Avinu. And the same is true if I come and say that there are not 8 psukim, but there are 28 or whatever. That's one thing. To come and say that most of the Torah was written at a different time, that's already quantity here makes a huge difference. Are you amending at the edges, or are you trying to transform the whole text? The text is transformed if you say the majority or a great deal. So if you come and say that that certain psukim reflect a different perspective, one, if you come and divide the Torah into a document and hypothesis, you are transforming the text. So you have to ask yourself always, in such examples, not only about the content, the local content, you have to ask about the context, and does this create, A, what is the metaphysic? B, does this create transformation of the entire enterprise, or does it nibble away at the edges, in which case it's a whole different thing. One final comment in this regard. I said before that beneath many of these interpretations, there is there's an underlying metaphysic which is more problematic. Now, what has become dangerous, and I'll speak about this at the end again, is that we don't come and say, okay, Orthodox belief. If I were to come, let's take an example of history. I would come and offer you 4 or 5 different interpretations of the French Revolution or whatever. This is a Marxist interpretation. This is a Christian interpretation. This is a secular interpretation. This is a great man theory of history interpretation, and so on and so forth. So you would recognize that the different interpretations represent different approaches to life and history in general. The Marxist will approach history from one perspective, a feminist from another perspective, a psychoanalyst from a third perspective, and so on and so forth. However, you can do it differently. You can go and talk about approach A, B, and C and present them as reflecting a certain perspective. This is the Marxist approach, this is the feminist approach. And then C, you present this objectively. You don't say this is the humanist approach. You then say, and C, you just present this fact. So of course you're creating a bias, because A and B reflect a particular perspective. C is supposedly objective. And this is where part of the problem arises regarding biblical criticism. It's not only what is being said, it's also at times a matter of presentation. In theory, if a person goes to college or to academia, so in theory, in an ideal world, he's supposed to understand the philosophy of science. And the philosophy of science can be applied, of course, not only to natural science, but also to he's supposed to understand the philosophy of the history of the humanities. Hegel writes about the philosophy of history and the history of philosophy. So in an ideal world, a person would be aware of all this, and he would recognize that his professor also doesn't live in a vacuum. He also is a product of his time and his perspective and his metaphysic. And he would recognize this. However, it often doesn't work like that. Because if a person speaks as a Rav, or he speaks as a priest or whatever, he's labeled as representing or advocating for a certain set of beliefs, or he's presenting something objectively, academically, he's presenting it objectively. Now, obviously, he's also reflecting a certain set of, as I said before, a certain set of beliefs or axioms, yet it's not always evident to the listener because it's presented, quote-unquote, objectively. And especially, what often happens is that natural sciences, in theory, this is true here also, I said before, and if a person would take a course in philosophy of science, he would be aware of this as well. But nevertheless, when all said and done, even though we recognize that there too it's not 100% objective, nevertheless, science produces results by which we, at the end of the day, we send rockets to the moon based upon how science functions. At the end of the day, we eradicate diseases based upon this. So even though, no matter all the disqualifiers and the disclaimers, when you study philosophy of science, at the end of the day, deep down, we really believe it's true and it works. We believe it's true because it really works. Now, the humanities, of course, it's a whole different story. It remains, to a large degree, a perspective. You cannot prove, at the end of the day, you can't really prove that deconstructionism is correct or incorrect, and there'll be no way to verify it experimentally, even negatively. However, though, what we tend to, if you want to, basically to project the prestige of the natural sciences onto the humanities as well. At least academia, knowingly or not, often tries to project the same prestige because this is all science. When originally science of Judaism was called Chokhmat Yisrael, which means wisdom. And when they came at some later stage, it became called Mad'ei Yadut. It was the switch, at least in Hebrew, from Chokhmah to Mada is subtle but very clear. There's an agenda there, meaning Chokhmah is a matter of wisdom and opinion. At the end of the day, opinion of wise people is not science. Science is something much more authoritative and objective, and they went out of their way to change it from, I'm saying in the Hebrew, and to change it from Chokhmah to Mada, from wisdom to science, and I think I'm not saying it's done on purpose, but at the end of the day, the listener who comes and is exposed to this, so he takes away that this is objective truth. The rabbi in shul is homiletics, but the professor is talking objective truth. But at the end of the day, both are, in a sense, reflect, if they do the job properly, both are reflecting certain perspectives. The rabbi is not just stealing off the internet or reading, but he's doing a serious job of analyzing the text. He's also presenting a deep analysis. Just he's doing it from a different set, from a different perspective. Now, all this is more or less about the theology, and maybe I haven't elaborated enough in places which demand elaboration, but this is the general scheme or outline. However, I don't think that this is the crucial issue. As I said before, you can take many of these. Some of these are incompatible with our beliefs. Some are not. Some can be integrated. Some must be rejected. I think the real issue, or it's not the real issue, but an additional issue, which is probably even more important, is not only the question of the content, but also the question of the perspective and the approach. And I'd like for 2 minutes to talk about the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah, the mitzvah to study Torah, has a dual element to it. Rav Zevin wrote, Rav Zevin Zatzal, who's Rav Yerushalayim, he died about 40 years ago. He wrote a very nice article based upon the Baal HaTanya Shulchan Aruch, based upon really sources in Chazal, that there's a dual element to the mitzvah of learning Torah. One is acquiring knowledge. The other is the experience of learning. If you want, and I won't elaborate upon this at the moment, that's the reason why we say the mitzvah twice every day. V'shinantam levanecha, v'imadatem otam et b'neichem. But we say Kriyat Shema twice a day. V'shinantam levanecha means deep learning. It means acquiring knowledge. Either analysis, you analyze them in depth, sharply, or it means that you can repeat it. In other words, that you acquire the knowledge and you attain it, or you retain it actually. That's and v'limatam b'nechem means to learn, even though you don't necessarily remember. It's the activity of learning. The mitzvah has a dual element. One is acquiring the knowledge. The other is simply the act of learning. There's a midrash which is the following: a person who learns and forgets. He learns and forgets. Like all of us, he forgets everything he learned. How should we view this? So the midrash is like this: the tipshim, or the fools say, well, he forgot everything. And what do they compare it to? You have a bucket in which you draw water. The bucket is full of holes. So by the time the bucket ends up in your kitchen, there's no water left. The Pikrim say, in other words, the more clever, the wiser people, the more profound people say, in the meantime the bucket was wet. Or to put it differently, even though you don't remember anything, you had the experience of learning. It's like saying, I went swimming, but all the water disappeared. But in the meantime, I enjoyed the swim. In other words, I engaged in the act of learning. And we have many halachic expressions of this. To give a well-known example, the Gemara tells us about Ben Dama, Rabbi Shmuel's nephew, who he learned everything. He came one day and he said, I learned the entire Torah, I know everything from A to Z and from Z to A. Do I have to continue learning or not? Now, if he went to medical school or he went to law school, and you come and tell us he passed all the exams, he knows everything, we would say, fine, so now you can take a vacation, because if you have all he wants is the knowledge, the utilitarian knowledge, you want him to have possession of the knowledge, you possess all the knowledge, so you've done your duty. So they told him, Bisman shul yom v'layla, don't take a vacation when it's neither day nor night. In other words, you have to continue engaging in learning. That he won't increase his knowledge. He will not increase his knowledge by an iota. He knows everything, presuming the claim is correct. He knows everything. Nevertheless, he has to continue to learn, because the activity is no less important than the knowledge itself. Or conversely, a person, and we also told in the Gemara, that if a person recites the same chapter every day, he lacks the ability to learn. So every day he says the same chapter. He says Kriyat Shema twice a day, but only Kriyat Shema, nothing else. He fulfills the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Even though once more he's not increasing his knowledge, because the mitzvah is at its most basic level is the engaging activity of learning. Now, why is this so? Because Talmud Torah is supposed to do two things. It's supposed to provide us with the knowledge, to understand the world around us, to understand the halachic world, to understand the world we live in, to get to know God's values and His wisdom. However, above and beyond that, it's simply interacting with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. It's simply experiencing a common goal. It's simply interacting with Him. We have many midrashim. God learns. Why? Not because He needs the knowledge. He wants to interact with us. We use Torah as a means for interaction between man and God, the same way we do tefillah. You can pray, in which case you address God. There's prophecy when God addresses man. And then there's learning, which they engage in joint activity. It's the same way with Lahavdil. With my children, I can talk to them. They can talk to me. We can have a conversation, a soul-to-soul conversation. But we can do something else. Often the most effective way of bonding with a child is not to go and talk to him about the relationship. It's rather to do something together. It's to play ball with him. It's to have a game. It's to sit in the phone and play Monopoly with the kid or whatever. The act is no less important than the knowledge. Now, this is describing the mitzvah itself. Now, to move on to biblical criticism. A person can engage in criticism implies position yourself on the outside. Now, a person can, if we talk about the academic study, I can do it from the perspective of an insider, of an outsider. I can engage, I can say this is a method which I choose, and I do it out of religious motivation, I do it out of a sense of trying to interact between man and God, and so on. However, at least the phrase criticism implies that the critic is outside the playing field. If you think for a moment about a music critic, a film critic, a sports writer, so they're always outside the play. They're on the outside, pontificating about the players and the musicians and the actors, how they're doing. They're not participants, they're observers, and even more so, they are critical observers. I remember once I was at a bris, and there was an uncle who was photographing the event, and all of a sudden they called to give him a kibbutz in Birkas Hamazon, and he was like shaking out. It totally threw him off balance, because he was an outside observer recording the event, and all of a sudden he was asked to become a participant. And the transition from observer to participant really sent shockwaves. He didn't know how to digest it, and it took like 2-3 minutes to sit down and say the Harachaman. And whenever you're a critic, you basically place yourself outside the system, criticizing this, and there's certain superiority. Whenever you read an actor or an outfielder complaining about how it's criticized in the press, often part of it is, who is he to criticize me? He's never been to the playing field, and he's never tried to play an instrument, and how dare he? And I had the same person written the exact same thing as advice. Or had he been a pitching coach or a batting coach or a musical teacher rather than a critic, it would have been accepted differently because he would have been seen as an insider, that's an outsider. And part of the problem with biblical criticism or Talmud or the like is not the content necessarily, it's the posture. It's a sense of the superiority of being outside. Now, this is not inherent, as I said before, it's not inherent in an academic approach. We do talk about a critic, so normally the position of a critic is that of the person outside, or to put differently, you are no longer experiencing. It's not the sense of interacting, it's the sense of judging. And when you're a judge, you're judging from the outside. Now, it's possible to employ these methods without judging. I think I think there are people who indeed do so. They take these methods as methods, but try to stay within and to experience them within. But often, certainly if a person goes to a secular liberal arts college, more often than not, the professor is criticizing for the outside rather than the inside. And that creates a whole different set of problems because it puts you outside when you talk with the narrator instead of the Kodesh Baruch Hu, or when you talk in Hebrew about Haker, with an Aleph, of course, instead of the Kodesh Baruch Hu or Ribono Shel Olam, the sense of warmth, the sense of a religious perspective, meaning have a relationship, a man-God relationship, becomes different because now I'm analyzing the biblical narrator and so on. It creates a sense of distance and alienation, which I think is probably more dangerous than often in the content themselves. This leads to the final point. I spoke about two things until now. A, some of the theological issues. B, the experiential issue. There's also the educational question, which means we have to ask ourselves not only, in light of what I said before, some of the content is compatible. You can decide to use it, you decide not to utilize it. Some is, of course, is objectionable because it clashes, but some of the content clashes directly with the most basic axioms of our belief. Some we can reinterpret, some doesn't clash, it's a suggestion which we can utilize. Some we can reinterpret that we don't have. Some of we can certainly reinterpret if need be. However, that's in terms of the objective content. The other question, though, is, should we expose kids in the educational system to this? Should we, in other words, not only what should I do myself for my curiosity, but how should the educational system deal with this? Should we decide to expose everyone to it? Should we decide it's too dangerous, that some will be able to deal, some not? Now, I certainly don't think that, if we believe it's true and correct and enriching, that we should try to conceal it from children. However, you often have material that is, on the one hand, maybe parts of it are enriching, other parts are dangerous, and they have to ask us, like in any field in life, how do you balance risk versus benefit? Certain things, the benefits outweigh the risk. If there's a great benefit and minor risk, it's one thing. If in the reverse, there's great risk and minor benefit, you obviously won't do it. So on the one hand, I could always say, so the benefit is to understand the Torah better, which of course is a major, assuming that we can accept some of the methods. Now, I'm not saying we should, as before, I don't want to, some conclusions or methods may be compatible, and we may benefit from them. we may not, and I will not enter here into an attempt to discuss each and every method. It has to be done on a more individual basis, on a case-by-case basis, and a method-by-method basis. But in theory, a person could certainly believe they can derive certain benefit. If one, for instance, wants to take the position of Mordechai Breuer, that a lot of benefit can be gained from some of these methods and conclusions. So that's what are the risks? The risk can be, as I said before, the risk will be a function of what you expose a child to, and also under which conditions and which circumstances do you do that. And I think certain things are inherently risky. And maybe in a world, maybe I prefer not to expose kids to certain ideas, or at least not to do it at a young age. And what stage and what age you do makes a big difference. So that's one question. However, you have to ask a different question as well, which is, well, if I don't expose the kid within the educational system, if the yeshiva high school won't do it, he'll be exposed later on in college by people who are much less sympathetic. That means you have to ask yourself two questions. A, is it a good idea to expose or not? B, even if you think it's not a good idea, in theory and in a sense, you can go back to the ages-old question, what's better, innocent faith or more sophisticated but less innocent? It's a very old debate, and there are strong arguments on both sides. Is it better to remain with innocent, naive faith, the way Rita Levi advocated, or is it better to have a more sophisticated and less innocent view, the way the Rambam presumably thought? However, Rita Levi claims, and he's 1,000% right, that you can only ask this a priori. But in a society in which everyone will lose their innocence anyways, it's certainly better to give them sophisticated faith than once you lose your innocence, there's no way going back. And if we assume that the majority of the kids we're educating will be exposed to this either in high school or in college or through the internet or through the library or whatnot, and we assume that they will come across this, obviously it's better to provide a framework of reference, to provide guidance, to basically expose the issues and let them recognize that these conclusions, these approaches, and what they'll hear in academia or wherever else they pick it up is based upon certain assumptions, a certain metaphysics behind it, is a reflection of a certain cultural moment or approach, and then let them judge. Because if we do not expose them because we think it's too risky, and then they're exposed anyways, so it's a double whammy. Both are exposed, and there's no guidance. So the educational issue always be: is it better or not better? And here, in an ideal world, in a world in which it's a controlled environment, I think it depends very much on which content we're talking about. Some of it may be advisable, but if it's a question of everything or nothing in a controlled environment, I could certainly see an approach which come and say, it's better not to, better they should know a little less, better they should understand some psukim not in such great depth, but not be exposed to a system which wreaked havoc upon the belief of many, many people. However, I don't believe that we're living in a controlled environment necessarily, and therefore you have to ask yourself, well, if it's not a controlled environment and the kid will be exposed to this, we should do more to do two things. A, maybe to expose them and to guide them. And here I think it's been a school-by-school basis, a class-by-class basis almost. But however, there's also a middle ground, which is, I don't have to go and teach them now. I do, though, have to, A, express self-confidence. In other words, not to be apologetic, to explain and to state there are other methods, there are other approaches. When you grow older, maybe you're exposed to them. However, there are answers. We have our approach. Our approach is based upon a certain metaphysical approach, certain belief, certain faith and tradition, and it is thought out. We're not afraid of confronting other issues. If the child is inquisitive and seeking, you can at the moment you can explain to him and sit down with him and expose him and provide an approach. If you feel that he's too young, you're not prepared yet, you just make it available. You tell him that the other approaches. When the time comes, you'll be able to come and talk. We're able to provide you guidance then. In other words, between exposing to everything and between denying that systems exist, there's also the option saying there are other approaches, and in due time we'll be glad to sit down and provide assistance and guidance. What's more, I think all this can be done only locally. There's no outsider can come and say this is good for this school, this is good for that school. Every school has to do it on its own. The Amital family likes to tell a story how this educational dilemma. Amital's father-in-law was a Rav in Pardes Chana, and the school there was a school both with from and not from children. It was a community school, which there was a lot of debate within the Frum community whether to separate the school or into two separate schools, one Frum and one not Frum, or to keep it one community-wide school. And he went to, and since the debate kept on and on, he went to the Chazon Ish and solicited the Chazon Ish's advice what to do. And the Chazon Ish normally would give rapid-fire answers, or yes or no, and do this or do that, or don't do this or don't do that. Chazon Ish told him, wait a minute, I have to think about it. Spent 15 minutes pacing back and forth in his room, came back and said to him, there is a unique Siyata D'Shemaya that the Mord Asra has to decide these issues. Meaning, to translate it into our categories, some issues can never be decided globally, never be decided locally based upon the crowd you're dealing with, based upon the circumstances. And I think that's true in many, many areas as well. To summarize, bottom line, as I said before, I think that nowadays, the starting point has to be, it's not that we believe in Kadosh Baruch Hu because of Tanakh, it's rather we accept the Tanakh because we believe in the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And then the Kadosh Baruch Hu can write whatever Tanakh he wants, he can write a Tanakh, we just have to conform necessarily to standard rules or to the rules of literary composition or causality that we are normally familiar with. So if I wanted to build, if I want to defend a perspective in which you can reject, we can, the normal approach to a text does not necessarily apply to the Tanakh, I think it's absolutely possible and reasonable to make such a defense. People come and say, these rules apply to regular human text, this is a divine text. Divine texts work in different ways, they have different rules. Some miracles don't conform to the laws of physics, so neither do divine texts have to conform to the laws of literature or historical composition. It's a position which can be defended. However, we can also come and accept some of the conclusions. We come and say, nevertheless, the text, we can point out, by analyzing the text, we can point out all kinds of points of interest and inconsistencies, incompatibilities, or emphasis, or whatnot. And we can at times benefit from these. However, we have to ask us, these may often be incompatible with basic beliefs. And we have to ask ourselves, what are the underlying axioms and metaphysical assumptions beneath them? If the underlying axioms and assumptions are different than Orthodox beliefs, so obviously that explains the inconsistency or the incompatibility. If they are consistent, compatible, so then maybe we should, or in other cases in which they are proven beyond doubt, it's very difficult to argue with it. So maybe we have to redefine our position, and this happens often. The Rambam famously said that he believes the world was created, but if it be proven to him beyond any doubt that it was not created, he would reinterpret the text to reflect that position. So at times, if the data is so overwhelmingly convincing, we can reinterpret. However, it should be a last resort. And if we decide that simply the observations are not contingent upon a conflicting metaphysics, but simply are observations which are of interest, so then we can evaluate each and every one of them, their merits, and either accept them and integrate them or reject them. And it's often a question, and this I think is what happened, as I said before, in those commentators who employed such methods 700-800 years ago, they make the suggestions from the same metaphysics, just as interpretations. They can, as I said before, can be either accepted or rejected on a one-by-one basis. The other point is, the question is, we have to be careful not to ascribe greater prestige or to recognize that every perspective, both that of the Midrash and academia, both reflect a particular approach and particular perspective, and one is not objective and the other is subjective, but both either objective, both either subjective, namely, both reflect particular perspectives, and the lack of a metaphysic is also a metaphysic. To claim that I have no agenda, that's also in a very stating a position. A point I did not make before, but I think is important. We have to remember that we believe that Torah is a composite. It's Torah shebichtav and Torah shebal peh. And now, obviously, we can study Chumash, and we teach in schools. We teach Chumash as a separate discipline. But there are certain elements in which we view Torah shebal peh. At times, it's dictating the meaning of the psukim for Ein Tachat Ein, for instance. We have a tradition. Ein Tachat Ein means a particular thing, and certain other such psukim, we have certain traditions which accompany the text, which are called Torah shebal peh. Torah shebal peh accompanies Torah shebichtav. At times, it's a binding interpretation of Torah shebichtav, which of course, now this is part of the same issue. You can have this in a traditional setup as well. The Rashbam's Pshuto Shel Mikra often neglects also, if you want, Torah shebal peh. But I think we have to be aware that we view Torah shebal peh as an integral part of the system, and you have to ask yourself, how do you integrate Torah shebal peh into this, and without eradicating its position. Another point which I'll mention telegraphically and also did not mention before, this is not, it's a side point, but I think it's a point which is well worth being aware of. This doesn't have to be, but in practice, more often than not, the academic approach to Tanakh or to the Bible, if you want, focuses more upon the text and less upon the drama. In other words, it focuses more with the historical accuracy of the text, the mode of composition, the history of the text, the dating of the text, and the like, the veracity of the text, and less upon the human drama within it. Now, of course, take a literary approach; it's a whole different story. But I'm talking here less about the literary approach tonight. If you talk about, but in other words, I think it's important not to get caught up in whether it's a traditional or not traditional. It's important not to get caught up in the issues of only composition of the text and to lose sight of the drama. What really matters at the end of the day is the human drama within the text, and let's not lose sight of that because we're busy just dealing with the other questions. That's a side point, but it's important to recognize. The second point I made, which I think is crucial, is not only the question of the content, but the experience. Do you view the text as a critical outsider, from a position of superiority? Do you not feel emotionally attached? Do you talk about the narrator? Do you talk about do you talk about the Kodesh Baruch Hu or Hakel or whatever? And with the sense of varmkeit, of warmth and attachment that you feel, and is this somewhat inhibited by coming from a more academic perspective? And the final point is the educational consideration. Do you think it's wiser, it's better not to expose kids to issues? The Rambam famously said the Rambam should never have opened up for discussion the question of free will and predetermination, because if you don't have a good answer, better not to ask a good question if you don't have a good answer. That's the Rambam thought. The Rambam obviously thought differently. And we have to ask us here also, is it better not to expose kids to these questions? And if it is better, so that's A, a question in of itself. B, even if it is, and optimally maybe it is better not to expose, is it possible, living in 21st century North America, is it possible not to expose? If it's not possible, it's better to do it properly and in an educational setting, rather than to do it, to set them adrift on their own and then expose them without the backup or the guidance of the educational system. Thank you very, very much. It's food for thought. I said before, I probably stepped in more minds than I avoided, but I'm trying just to do my personal perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Lichtenstein. I don't know how long Rabbi Lichtenstein is able to stay afterwards entertaining questions. I know there are probably many questions, but we did suggest to people that there will be a Mariv afterwards, and I think it's good to stick to that. So we will now have Mariv. We'll put the Mechitza up and daven shortly, and those who can remain and ask questions for as long as Rabbi Lichtenstein is able to do so. Thank you very much for coming tonight.